They also erected a tent camp just upstream from the mouth of Bright Angel. This was a fairly rudimentary affair, but they could host visitors overnight, especially those who wanted to continue on up to the Kanab Plateau. Very often these were hunters who wanted to go up there and hunt mountain lions. And this was, in a way, kind of the predecessor to Phantom Ranch, although it was built to a much lower standard. It was located some distance down from Phantom Ranch, too, about where the present-day mule corrals are located, across from the campground. And to try to make things a little more civilized there, Rust and his partners set out dozens and dozens of cottonwood saplings, which they had acquired further up in Phantom Creek. And some of those did mature, and they're among the trees that give you shade now when you're down there. But just try to imagine how hot those rocks would have been with no trees at all. Well, there was a certain amount of traffic would come through, as I said, typically hunters. Their main dining hall was an open-air affair, 4 open walls and a brush arbor for shade. You really didn't want to spend too much time in the daytime inside one of those canvas tents. But the traffic really wasn't enough to sustain a toll keeper at the trail itself. So after a while, they simply took to guiding parties that made arrangements in advance, and they'd go down and meet them at the tram cage, charge the toll, and host them at Rust Camp. I think Dave was proud of his efforts, and maybe he could be forgiven for hoping that a rush of tourists would come in. But for most people, the tram remained a self-service operation. And you've probably heard the story about how in 1913, President Roosevelt arrived and didn't find anyone there to get him across the river, so they managed the crossing themselves. Well, through all of this work, Dave was able to find some diversions, and he was able to put his river running experience in Glen Canyon to some good use. He had become friends with the Culver brothers, and early in 1909, in March, he and Emery Cole set off on an upriver excursion and made it up a little ways below Saugaliger Rapid, but Emery wanted to shoot canyon scenes, and Dave did the rowing. He was familiar enough with Colorado to know how you could make use of the eddy line to make your way up without as much effort. Well, through all of this work, Dave was coming to appreciate the canyon as a great work of geology and as an amazing scenic feature. Their tourist business hadn't yet taken off, so they placed more of their efforts into improving things from the north side of the canyon. They would take tourists on up Bright Angel Creek, shown here in a photograph from 1909, and then host them at a little outfitting cabin that they built up on the Kaibab Plateau. If you drive out on the Cape Royal Road a few miles from the main entrance road on the Kaibab, there's a large meadow with a gigantic old aspen tree that's fallen over. And this was the location of the little outfitting cabin that they had there. This was their base of operations for a number of years for guiding horseback trips all along the length of the Kaibab Plateau. Dave was especially fond of DeMott Park, and he wrote in one of the articles he wrote that to him the park was as graceful as the curves of the human form. He was starting to take more notice of just the beauties of this landscape, and increasingly he was spending more time guiding people on pack trips than he was down at their camp and tram crossing. He found that it made more sense to take a party out for a month or more at a rate that he could charge per day and simply wait for whoever would come down and charge a $1 toll to cross the river. Well, meanwhile, Dave's mentor, Edwin Woolley, was at work too. Here he is on the left, guiding a party of political notables, including Utah Senator George Sutherland and Governor E.L. Thomas on the right there to show them their trail and hopefully get more interest in building roads down up onto the Kaibab. In fact, in 1909, Woolley led what seems to be the first auto expedition to the North Rim, at least up onto the Kaibab. He kind of dragooned his nephew up in Salt Lake to take two expensive cars down all the way from Salt Lake and take them up on this rough and rocky road up onto the Kaibab. It was significant that Dee wasn't using his own car for this. Their account of it says that by the time they returned to Salt Lake City, they had gone through 9 tires. But with work over the years, by about 1913, you could drive a car up to about the Bright Angel Ranger Station and then take a horse or wagon on to Bright Angel Point. And you will probably recognize this as the limestone outcrop right at the edge of Bright Angel in the pre-Park Service and pre-guardrail era. This photo was taken in 1913. And of course, the view from Bright Angel Point's always been the main draw to the North Rim. But for Dave, it was really just the first of many places he liked to take his clients along the edge of the Kaibab. He was becoming increasingly enchanted with these longer pack trips. And then there was a sort of a convergence of factors here. In 1914, he met a client who, more than anybody else, influenced his approach to guiding. And this was an attorney from New Jersey named George C. Fraser. Well, Fraser was a geologist and had trained at Princeton. I should say he was a geologist by avocation. He was an attorney by profession. He had the money to travel. He hit on the idea that what he wanted to do was to retrace the travels of the great scientist explorers of the Colorado Plateau, John Wesley Powell, Clarence Dutton, G.K. Gilbert. And he had the money to do this. He was also a book collector, and he owned all of these original scientific works, such as Dutton's Tertiary History. So Fraser engaged Dave Russ to take him on a journey where they simply hopped along all of these plateau viewpoints and actually took along the copies of the geologic work so that they could stand at these rim viewpoints and correlate what they could see with what the scientists had written. Well, Dave thought this was a great approach. His term for it was seeing as they saw. And he kind of adopted this as his approach for many of the subsequent trips. On this first trip in 1914 with the Frasers, they went clear out to the Powell Plateau. And the photograph taken from Dutton Point here is looking back at Point Sublime, which is another of the great canyon overlooks that they visited. From Powell's Plateau, they went down the Bass Trail to the river. And at this point, Dave returned and left his client in the hands of Willie Bass, who came down from the South Rim. And Fraser spent a night alone at the bottom of the canyon with his son and recorded how frightful it was just listening to the roar of the river bouncing off the canyon walls. But he was game for this sort of thing and returned to do many more trips with Dave Rust. Around this time, Dave was branching out and trying to kind of grow his guiding business during the off-season when he wasn't teaching school. One of the canyons he liked to take people up into was not well known at the time. Powell had called it the Makunterweep, but people in southern Utah knew it as Little Zion. But in 1913, when this photograph was taken, it still wasn't well known. And here's the reason why. The roads there just weren't up to snuff. You could get in there fairly well under dry conditions, but don't even think about it if it had rained very hard. So in 1914, with the Frasers in tow, Dave took them up into Zion Canyon. This is if you can imagine, the main road of Zion Canyon in 1914. Now remember, it was a national monument at this point, but the National Park status didn't come along until 1919.